Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and I'm really pleased to have in the studio with me Ed Wytkind. He is the president of the Transportation Trades Department with the AFL-CIO and a member of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Transportation Automation. Ed, great having you with us here.
Thank you.
Glad to have you back on the program. Let's start out. There's a bunch of stuff that I want to talk to you about. Let's start out with Donald Trump's $1 trillion infrastructure package. This back in 2010, I think it was, Nancy Pelosi got a $1 trillion infrastructure package, as I recall, out of the House, and it got filibustered by Republicans in the Senate, among other things. I mean, she also got a package out that did away with the tax breaks for exporting jobs and replaced them with tax breaks for importing jobs. That got filibustered by the Republicans. So it's like for 8 years they said, no, we can't do anything. And now they've got a Republican president. Yes, we can do things. Or not? Is this a scam, or is this something like what Nancy Pelosi passed?
Oh, we sure hope it's not a scam. I think he put $1 trillion on the table, right?
Yeah.
In the joint session speech. But there's no details yet. Not a dime of federal money's been put on the table yet.
Well, he said public-private partnership. What does that mean?
He said, well, that's a good question. If it's just a public-private partnership proposal, that means it's going to rely exclusively on private investors with essentially tweaking of the tax code to incentivize it, to invest in projects that, frankly, they're not going to want to invest in. I've been saying this all over the country. Only a small sliver of projects work with P3s, because what P3s are designed to do is help somebody make money.
Where does P3, public-private partnership?
And that's the problem with it, is that it's called P3 because there's public in it. So it requires a public investment to make it work. But at the end of the day, there's only certain kinds of projects that you can try to toll your way to creating the revenues to service debt and then eventually make somebody money. Because we have to remind ourselves, these investors don't come in because there's some public good involved. They come in because they want to figure out a way to make money off of our infrastructure. So it's not really a model that works without real federal money involved.
How do we re-educate the American public about just the idea of public investment? The Republican Party, since Reagan, has promoted this meme that anytime the federal government spends money, it's a cost. It's an expense. And the idea of public investment is not even, I'm not even sure they teach this stuff in civics classes anymore. I mean, it's completely gone from the vocabulary of Republicans. Democrats talk about it as if everybody understands what they're talking about. I don't think everybody understands that. You put money into the Eisenhower interstate highway system, you jumpstart the economy. If you build out high speed internet service like South Korea has, there's nobody in South Korea who doesn't have literally nobody in South Korea who doesn't have high speed. And I'm talking, their normal consumer broadband is 2 to 4 times faster and half the cost of our business grade. How do we do that?
Well, we do that by staying at it. We've never stopped talking about what you just said. When you replace a bridge, that's a 60, 70, 80-year investment, right? It's not just an expenditure of public dollars. The problem we have is probably not educating the public. It's educating people that we elect to Congress, because the public gets it. When you put a vote to the public, about 8 out of 10 times, including gas tax increases for public transit or for roads or whatever the case is, they're passing them because they trust that the money locally or at the state level is actually going to be used for its purpose. Whereas when you say to them, hey, let's raise the federal gas tax, they get very skeptical because they actually don't believe Washington's going to ever do what it says it wants, what it says it's going to do. And I think that's part of the problem. So we need to educate the people we elect. I think their voters are already there. They're ready to spend money on this stuff because they understand that, congested highways, long lines at airports, transit systems that are just falling apart is not in their interest.
Right. And Trump is walking around talking about how, our airports look like something out of the third world. He's right in some regards. Some of them are very spiffy, but many of them are not. But how is that amenable to figuring out a way to make a buck for somebody? I mean, there's obviously the actual construction itself is not done by government employees.
Right. That's done by private contractors who are contracted through public authorities, right? So you get part of the money from Washington. Some of it comes from the state. And then they hire private contractors to do the heavy construction. But the airport is a great example. Airports have had some initiatives over the years where private investors, including foreign private investors, have been involved in modernizing them. The president's actually correct about the narrative. Our infrastructure is falling apart. And I also agree with him that we should start using public dollars more robustly to employ Americans. Part of the problem we had, too, is we're finishing a generation that found every loophole it could in our laws.
Yeah, but he wants to do this by taking out Davis-Bacon.
Well, see, that's an important hand. We're going to make a look, Rich Trumka the other day said he's going to call balls and strikes. You cannot say that your goal is to invest in infrastructure, put millions of people to work, and raise wages. He's actually used the term raise wages before, and then gut the rights of workers to join unions. So Davis-Bacon's a prevailing wage law, right? What's Davis-Bacon designed to do? It's designed to make sure that you don't use labor as your tool to underbid projects and do them on the cheap when it comes to how you pay your workers. But it goes deeper than that. There are a lot of people in the Republican Party that want to get away with actually destroying unions in this country. That's a bad way to get the middle class growing again.
Yeah. Very well said, and totally agree. And Ed is one of those rare guys who really has his finger on the pulse of not just politics and not just unions, but I like the country. You get it. You get it. And a lot of people don't get it. A lot of, both in your business, in my business, and just in the general public. So let's talk about public transportation. We were talking off the air earlier, and you were talking about how this, right here in D.C., the metro, they're shutting down trains. They're doing these kind of rolling blackouts of trains so that they can upgrade the system. And that this isn't something that happened last week. Just like nationwide, this isn't something that happened last week. How is it that we stopped funding public transportation infrastructure around this country?
Yeah, it's a sad state. I mean, there are transit systems all over the country with very similar problems. Just, the local D.C. system is just a good, powerful symbol of the problem. It's an outrage that we have a generation of politicians who decided that all these shiny transportation systems would remain shiny forever. We're not spending money on it. As we know, just in our home, things break. And if you don't fix it, it gets worse. And we've deferred maintenance and modernization projects across the country in every mode of transport for probably close to 50 years. And so, when we had that horrific wreck at the local D.C. metro system where a train collided into another train because its positive train control system that stops the train from colliding, stopped functioning, that's because this stuff gets old and it doesn't work anymore. And so now these rolling blackouts, as you call them, that's a product of just deferring forever and then finally realizing, wow, the bill's gotten pretty big now. So what do we do about it?
But it was like if you're old enough to remember the 60s and 70s, it's like we put a man on the moon. In 1961, Jack Kennedy said, I want to put a man on the moon in a decade. We did it in 8.5 years. It's like, and when he said it, he was laughed at. Are you kidding? We have no technology to do this. We don't have we don't have the launch technology. We don't have we can't do this. And they did it. And Dwight Eisenhower, we're going to cover the nation with an interstate highway system. And everybody got it that we could do all this cool stuff, but we also had a top marginal tax rate when Jack Kennedy was president of 91%, and when Dwight Eisenhower was president. Lyndon Johnson dropped it down to 74% in 1964, but and everybody says that was Kennedy's tax cut. It wasn't, and Kennedy wasn't. And you go back to the debate with Nixon, and Kennedy said very clearly, we're going to lower the top rate, close loopholes, and actually collect more money from wealthy people. So, even that 64 cut was actually an increase in revenue for people who made more than $1 million a year, an increase in the taxes that we were taking from them. But by killing off our tax base, when Reagan came into office, taking the top rate and the capital gains rate both down to 25%, he basically guaranteed that we wouldn't be able to maintain our infrastructure.
Well, that's a really important point. But remember, we developed a user fee-based system for some of our transportation industry.
The highways.
Not just highways. For ports, they have their own user fee collection system. That's always been a problem. Only parts of our system have a user fee-based system. But the other thing we did, we not only starved our Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, by ridiculous tax cutting for decades, we also didn't upgrade our mechanisms for collecting fees to pay for this stuff. So our federal gas tax hasn't been increased since the early 90s.
Right.
Our port problem in this country, ports falling apart and not being modernized, is because we collect the money, we just don't spend it. It's the typical gimmickry in Washington.
Really? What, does it go into the general fund? And
yeah,
then
they use it to mask other budget problems or to achieve other budget objectives. So let's say you have $1 in there to spend. I think they're spending about 60 cents on the dollar out of that fund. Fortunately, the current Republican chairman actually increased the numbers coming out of there in the last bill he did. So it was a good improvement, but it's still not dollar for dollar. So we also don't even have trust in our trust funds where you collect the money, you and I pay it, others pay it through fees. So it's broken, but it's also broken because there's a narrative not being told, which is public transit systems in this country are, for example, having record ridership. Demand is just off the charts, but they're being forced to do more with less, which is typical Washington jargon, right? You can't do more with less. You do less with less.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. We're doing a lot less, and it's becoming less safe because these systems are falling apart, and they're becoming safety hazards, too.
So Trump announced earlier this week that he wants to increase military spending by $54 billion, but it's got to be revenue neutral, which means we're going to cut $54 billion from everything else. Is part of that everything else our infrastructure?
Well, that's a good question because, again, some of our revenues come from fees, gas tax and other fees, but a lot of the money we spend on infrastructure comes out of the general treasury. So the answer is yes, unless they redline it and say leave it alone. But if they're saying, cut domestic programs by $54 billion, I have a tough time believing transportation doesn't get affected by it. So think about the combo message. We're going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, but we're going to cut transportation in our budget. Now, I hope to be surprised, but I'm expecting that someone's going to take a haircut.
Yeah,
transportation.
I suspect you're right. You are on the advisory committee on transportation automation with the U.S. Department of Transportation. So you're sitting in the room, presumably, with a bunch of people who are, at the cutting edge of the automation of transportation. I'm assuming that's like driverless cars and stuff like that. Where does this go? I mean, there's all this, on the one hand, concern, and on the other hand, kind of giddiness about, we're going to end up with driverless cars and everything is going to be public transportation functionally, and all these various business models that have evolved out of this, where there's no employees and all that. What do we do? How do we run an economy? How do we have, a workforce where work is evaporating?
Well, I think the UAW in the very beginning days of robotics and manufacturing plants, whoever was on the tour, maybe the president of the union, said something like, do those robots carry credit cards? Because I think it makes the point, right, which is we're creating another wave of automation that's going to kill probably, if not millions, at least hundreds of thousands of jobs. But it's also going to affect wages because, remember, the tech titans are the ones that are pushing this automation, and they, unfortunately, have become notorious for not only badly underpaying their employees, but resisting any unionization. So one of the solutions to waves of automation is to give workers a voice on the job so that they can share in the bounty they produce. And they're not going to share in the bounty if they're left to represent themselves. So that's one thing. The second thing, though, is there's a safety component. When you introduce driverless cars or trucks or any other transportation system that doesn't have a real operator in there to intervene in situations, there's a huge safety question that needs to be answered by federal regulators, which is, can this stuff be safe? And if you Google the question, these driverless vehicles are still crashing.
Yeah,
it's not as if they're trouble-free.
Well, it's airplanes, right? I'm a pilot. I'm not a commercial pilot, but but the commercial planes right now, you can literally program them from takeoff to landing and never touch anything. I mean, we've got driverless airplanes right now. They're flying every day, but nobody would ever do it without somebody in the cockpit.
Well, that's the thing. You need human intervention in the imperfect world of transportation. It's the same thing that's
just in case.
Yeah, here's what scares me. We have a bunch of tired truckers right now in the country, right? Who drive the vehicle but are getting tired because they're overworked and underpaid. You introduce driverless trucks with monitors, which is what some of the trucking industry is saying, which means you're going to be in the truck, but you're not really going to drive it. You just monitor it, and you're expecting that person to be awake, alert, and ready to intervene during a bad moment. I think it's foolish.
Yeah, when a moose comes out and runs across the road or something like that.
It's amazing what's happening in the space. It's happening faster than people realize. That's why I'm agonizing about it so much, because it's coming faster. We're talking in years. This is not a decades-long thing. This is probably 3 to 5 years we will see introduction of these technologies in a serious way.
Right. We're moving into the Jetson world.
We are, and unfortunately, the business models contemplate not having many, if any, employees, and the ones that are left are independent contractors who are not paid enough and have no benefits.
Should we be looking at something like a guaranteed minimum income?
Here's the problem with that. We are going to have that debate, but it distracts from the larger question, which is we're creating an automation wave that's going to destroy jobs and wages. But then while we focus on a universal basic income, we're ignoring the fact. The fact is we need to create middle-class jobs. And you're not going to do that with a universal basic income. You do that with collective bargaining.
Yeah, excellent.
I'm going to keep pushing very hard on that. That's the only hope for these workers.
Wytkind, he is the president of the Transportation Trades Department at the AFL-CIO and a member of the USDOT Advisory Committee on Transportation Automation. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.